They told me, "Sit quietly, old woman." Funny how people assume age erases a spine. I was 78 that morning, not dead, and I heard every word Parker's boys spat at me while dropping another sack of their trash onto my lawn. I stood there in my slippers, holding my breath so I wouldn't say something sharp enough to earn me more trouble. But the trouble was already here, crumpled in a black plastic bag at my feet, buzzing from whatever spoiled inside it. The sun wasn't even fully up. Light slid across the roofs like it was afraid to touch this part of Linden Point. A cold wind rattled the loose board in my fence, the one they'd broken last month and never bothered to fix. It kept swinging open, like a mouth trying to speak on my behalf. "Pick it up, Dylan," I said quietly. "It's your garbage." He didn't. He smirked. That thin-lipped, half-grown smirk boys get when they're not taught better. "Mom says you should stop complaining, says you're losing it." "Your mother is mistaken," I replied. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. He shrugged and walked off, letting the gate slam behind him. Their gate, not mine. They'd replaced mine with theirs after the storm 2 years back, uninvited and unasked, then acted like they'd done me a favor. That's how it always began with the Parkers. A small favor that turned into a foothold that turned into ownership that turned into expectation, and expectation, in time, turned into the belief that I owed them silence. I bent down and tied the garbage bag shut. My joints protested, but they'd protested louder in my 40s. Age teaches you which pain deserves your attention and which doesn't. This one didn't. I carried the bag to my bin, set it down gently, and straightened. Across the hedge, Parker's garage door was half open, though it was barely 6. A strip of dim yellow light spilled out, and shadows moved inside. Too many for a normal morning. That garage had become a strange creature these past months. It hummed at night. It coughed. It swallowed trucks and spat out crates none of us ever saw in daylight. I knew enough not to stare, but I wasn't blind. And they knew I wasn't blind. I made myself tea and sat by the window, my hands wrapped around the cup, warming the stiff folds of my fingers. The Parkers' voices drifted from their backyard, sharp, hurried, almost frantic. I couldn't make out words, only tones. Tones of people hiding something, or losing grip on something they didn't want found. An hour later, Helen Parker marched onto my porch without knocking. She never knocked anymore. "Agnes, you really need to stop causing problems," she said, crossing her arms. "That boy was helping. You should be grateful." "For dropping trash on my lawn?" I asked. "For trying to keep the peace," she snapped. "We're busy people. We don't need extra stress because you think every little thing is an attack." I looked at her calmly. Her mascara was smudged, as if she hadn't slept. Her blouse was buttoned wrong. Something in her trembled beneath the veneer of superiority. "I didn't start anything," I said. Her lips tightened. "Then don't start now. Just sit quietly, all right? Stay out of things that don't concern you." There it was, the sentence I'd heard before. The sentence they thought summed up my place in this world. She turned and left before I could answer. Or maybe she didn't care to hear my answer. Sometimes silence is the only language people like her understand. They mistake it for surrender. They shouldn't. I stepped outside a little later, sweeping the porch. Birds rustled in the hedge, restless. The air carried that metallic scent that comes before rain or before trouble. Across the yard, the garage door thudded shut, too quickly, as if pushed by someone startled. I wasn't frightened, not yet. But there was a pressure in the air, The kind a woman feels when something in her life begins to shift, even if no one else sees it. I kept sweeping. Slow strokes. Steady. A habit built from years of surviving what life puts in front of you. When the last of the dust lifted off the porch, I leaned on the broom and felt, with startling clarity, that this morning was the first step towards something none of us were prepared for. Not the Parkers, and not even me. And certainly not the ones who believed an old woman could be told to sit quietly. By noon, the neighborhood had settled into its usual weekday quiet, the kind that leaves too much room for thoughts you'd rather not entertain. I tried distracting myself with watering the azaleas, but even the plants seemed uneasy, their leaves trembling though the air was still. It wasn't the weather. It was the Parkers. Their restlessness seeped across the fence like a draft I couldn't plug up. I heard them before I saw them. Heavy steps, hurried whispers, the scrape of something dragged across concrete. Then the side gate creaked open. Not my gate. Theirs. Dylan slipped through first, followed by his older brother Mark. Mark was 22, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like a man who mistook size for authority. He held a crate between his hands, the same kind I'd seen them unload under moonlight. They didn't notice me at first, or maybe they didn't care. Mark dropped the crate onto the patch of grass right beside my broken fence board. The ground shook lightly under my feet. "Hey," I said. Not sharply, not kindly, just enough. Mark turned, eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" "You're on my property." He snorted. "It's just grass, lady. Grass I pay taxes for." Dylan mumbled something under his breath, a word boys use when they think adulthood excuses disrespect. Mark nudged him, then looked back at me with that look men get when they're used to winning every small war simply because no one wants to start a big one. "We'll move it later," he said, already turning away. "No," I replied. "You'll move it now." Something flickered in his face. Not fear, not anger, but recognition. Recognition that the old woman he thought would fold had just refused to. The refusal annoyed him. "Look," he said, stepping closer, "we don't need your complaining today. We've got deliveries, schedules." Deliveries. I repeated the word slowly, letting it settle between us like dust. At noon, on a weekday, and through my yard. Mark's jaw tightened. "Our business isn't your concern. It becomes my concern when it crosses my fence." Dylan shifted uneasily, glancing toward the garage. The door was cracked open again, just enough to show movement inside. Shadows, more crates, silhouettes that weren't Parker family. That detail landed heavier than the crate had. They weren't just hiding things. They were working with people from somewhere else. Mark lifted the crate with a grunt and stepped back through the gate. "Come on," he muttered to his brother. "Before she calls the city." A hollow laugh escaped me. Not because it was funny, but because the idea was absurd. The city wouldn't come. Not for an old woman's complaint about a family that held this street like a clenched fist. I'd seen enough ignored calls in my time to know how easily women my age can be dismissed. They disappeared into their garage, voices rising into sharp, tense fragments. I caught pieces. Behind schedule. Missing paperwork. Can't risk another mistake. None of it sounded like the chatter of a family fixing bicycles or storing holiday decorations. Whatever they were doing, it was urgent, and it was illegal. I went back inside, closed the door quietly, and locked it. I wasn't frightened exactly, but I felt the way sailors must feel when the wind changes in a direction it shouldn't. A shift you can't see, but can sense in your bones. I made tea again. It tasted metallic, though the kettle was clean. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe it was the knowledge that trouble no longer lived on the edges of my life. It had stepped onto my lawn. Around 3, Helen Parker came storming across the yard as if she owned the sky above it. She didn't knock this time either. She slammed her hand against my door so hard the frame rattled. "Agnes!" she shouted. "Open up!" I did, but only halfway. "What is it now?" I asked. "Stop watching us!" she hissed. "You think we don't notice you peering through those curtains? You think we don't know you're trying to make problems?" "I'm tending my own home," I said. "If your activities spill into it, that's not my fault." Her breath hitched. "You don't get it. We're under pressure. We don't have time to deal with your paranoia. Just stay out of our business." "You brought your business onto my lawn." She stepped closer. So close I could smell the sweat and fear on her, sharp as vinegar. "Listen to me. I don't care how old you are. I don't care what sympathy you think you deserve. You keep your mouth shut about what you see. You hear me?" I looked at her, really looked. At the tremor in her hand, the twitch in her jaw, the faint bruise on her forearm. She tried to hide beneath her sleeve. She was cracking from inside, and whatever they were involved in was cracking them along with her. "I hear you," I said softly. "But you're mistaken if you think fear works on me." Helen blinked, thrown off by the calmness she didn't expect. "You're playing with fire, Agnes," she whispered. "And fire burns everyone." She left without waiting for a reply. The wind picked up. The broken fence board tapped against its hinges like a nervous heartbeat. I closed the door gently, slid the lock into place, and stood perfectly still in the quiet house. "Fire burns everyone," she'd said. Yes, I thought, but only if you stand too close without knowing where the exits are. By the next morning, the air felt heavier than the sky itself, as if the clouds had settled inside my chest instead of above the street. I slept poorly, waking every hour to the creak of the loose fence board and the muffled thumps from the Parkers' garage. Those sounds had become part of my nights, like a second heartbeat I hadn't asked for. At 7, I stepped outside to get the paper, one of the few routines that still belonged entirely to me. The street was empty, washed in that soft gray light that makes everything look honest for a brief moment. But the honesty didn't last. My gaze drifted to the Parkers' driveway. Their van, the one with the dented bumper and the peeling logo of a company that no longer existed, was backed up to the garage again. It hadn't been there when I went to bed. A man I didn't recognize stood beside it, smoking. Not a Parker. Taller, broader, older. He looked like someone who'd been carved out of a stone that had seen too many storms. He glanced at me once, long enough for me to know he'd registered my presence, but he said nothing. Just flicked ash onto the ground and turned away. I folded my paper under my arm and walked back to the door. No hurry, no panic. But my hands trembled slightly on the handle. Age doesn't weaken instincts, it sharpens them. You learn to feel danger like a change in temperature. Inside, I made oatmeal I had no appetite for and sat by the window. The stranger was gone, but the van remained, half swallowed by the dim garage. I watched shadows move inside, quick, anxious, purposeful. I should have looked away, but I didn't. Around 10, I went outside to sweep the porch steps. The sky threatened rain, though a dry wind kept rearranging the leaves in cautious spirals. I'd just started when someone called my name. "Mrs. Mercer?" I turned. It was neighbor Evelyn from across the street, holding her small terrier like a newborn. Evelyn was 65 but looked older. Worry shapes a face quicker than time does. "Morning," I said. She lowered her voice. "Are the Parkers giving you trouble again?" I considered lying, but I was too old to spend energy on pretending. "They've been assertive," I said. "That's one word for it." Evelyn's eyes darted toward the garage. "They woke us at 2 in the morning, some kind of shouting. Sounded like 3 or 4 men arguing." I nodded. "I heard them later." "Moving things." Evelyn bit her lip. "Do you think it's dangerous?" "Yes," I said. Quietly. Firmly. No point softening truth at our age. Lies protect the young. Honesty protects the old. Before she could answer, my gate gave a loud metallic groan. Mark stepped through, still in those heavy boots that made the ground seem smaller beneath him. His face was flushed, his breath uneven. He wasn't angry yet, but the potential for it sat just under his skin. "Hey," he barked at me. "Mom wants to talk." Evelyn stiffened beside me. I saw the fear flash over her face as quick as lightning. I didn't share it, but I felt something colder, a tiredness that sits deeper than fear ever could. "I'm busy," I said. He took 2 steps forward, too close for politeness, not close enough for a police report. She said now. And I said no. His jaw twitched. A small movement, but enough to show he wasn't used to hearing refusal from anyone, much less a woman old enough to be his grandmother. Evelyn clutched her terrier and backed away. I'll talk to you later," she murmured to me before disappearing across the street. I didn't blame her. Not everyone learns how to stand firm. Some simply learn how to leave quickly. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, impatient. "Look, we don't need trouble today. We've got things going on. So how about you keep the peace and come talk to her?" I placed both hands on the broom handle, steadying myself. "Your mother has already said what she wanted. And so have I." He blew out a frustrated breath and muttered something I couldn't hear. Then, without explanation, he turned and walked back toward the garage. I watched him disappear into its dim mouth, watched the door slam with a force that rattled the hinges. The wind picked up again, slapping the loose board on my fence like a metronome, marking the tempo of an approaching storm. I finished sweeping, went inside, and locked the door. The lock slid smoothly, as it always had, but this time I rested my hand on it longer than necessary. It's a strange thing, realizing the boundary between safety and danger is only a 1/4 inch of metal. I sat at the table, my tea cooling untouched, and let the truth settle like dust. The Parkers were no longer a nuisance. They had become a threat. And threats don't disappear just because you hope they will. I wasn't ready to fight them, but I was no longer willing to be frightened by them. Something inside me, something old, something stubborn, shifted like a door opening inward after years of being stuck. And for the first time, I wondered not if the Parkers would cross a line, but when. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of old pewter, the kind that steals the warmth from everything it touches. I felt it in my hands first, then in my shoulders, then somewhere deeper, as if the air itself had settled inside my chest. I tried distracting myself with chores, laundry, dusting, sorting old mail, but the house felt too quiet for comfort. Even the floorboards seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't the quiet that bothered me. It was the expectation that it would end. Around 5, a thud shook the side of my house. Not loud, but deliberate, like someone testing how far they could go before crossing the line. I froze where I stood, a dish towel in my hand, listening. Another thud. I stepped to the window. Mark was in my yard again. This time he wasn't carrying crates. He was carrying a broken section of my fence, a piece I recognized because it had belonged to my yard longer than Mark had been alive. He tossed it onto the grass like a branch fallen in a storm. Then he noticed me watching. "You're welcome," he called out. "For what?" I asked, opening the window just enough for my voice to reach him. "For cleaning up your mess. My fence wasn't broken until your brother backed the van into it." He smirked. "Accidents happen." "And respect doesn't," I replied. His smile faded. "You know, you could try being nicer." "I tried," I said softly. "You didn't." A quiet settled between us, heavy and sharp. He didn't like the simplicity of my answer. Simple truths often anger people who depend on complications to justify their behavior. He stepped closer to my porch. Too close. I could see a thin cut on his eyebrow. Fresh. Maybe from whatever fight they'd had the night before. His voice dropped. "You're making things worse for everyone. You know that?" "I'm tending my home." "You're making trouble inside it." He shook his head, almost pitying me. "You don't get what's going on. Just stay out of it. And yet you keep dragging it onto my property." That did it. His temper snapped like a dry twig. "You think you're smarter than us?" he barked. "You think watching from your window makes you some kind of sheriff? You're nothing but—" "Enough." The word came out of me so calm it startled even him. It startled me, too. At our age, we learn how to speak softly, but carry a long memory of when we didn't. He looked at me, really looked, as if searching for the fear he expected to see. But there wasn't any left. It had drained out of me like water from a cracked cup. He scoffed and kicked the fence board, cracking it in half. That was the moment the shift happened, not outside, but inside me. I felt something tighten with a quiet, decisive click, like the last notch on a belt. Not anger, not defiance. Just the solid understanding that I had tolerated the Parkers long past the point where patience was a virtue. He walked back through their gate, leaving the broken wood on my lawn. I watched him disappear into the garage where muffled voices rose, then fell, then rose again. I shut the window and locked it. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and folded my hands. My breath came slow and steady, though inside me something pulsed with a rhythm older than fear. I stayed like that for a while, until someone knocked on the front door. Not politely, not lightly. 3 heavy blows, each one a command. I opened it just a crack. Helen stood there, face red, hair unbrushed, sweat glistening on her forehead. Not the arrogant woman from yesterday, but someone frayed, stretched thin, unraveling. "We need to talk," she said. I doubt it. "Don't do this," she hissed, stepping close enough to make the crack in the door pointless. "Stop watching. Stop asking questions. Stop acting like any of this concerns you. Your son broke my fence. He'll fix it when he can. He broke it again today. Then stop provoking him." I let out a breath, slow and quiet. "Helen, you've lost control of your home. Don't try to control mine." She stared at me with something I'd never seen in her before. Fear. Not of me, but of what might happen if word of their activities got out. Her hands trembled. She pressed them together as if to keep them from showing it. "I'm warning you," she whispered. "You don't want to get involved with the people we're dealing with. They don't care how old you are. They don't care about anything." "I care," I said. "That's your problem." Caring gets people hurt. No, I replied. Cruelty gets people hurt. Caring just proves I'm still human. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She took a shaky step back. You're going to ruin everything, she said, voice trembling. I'm not the one doing the ruining. She swallowed hard, then turned and hurried back toward her house, shoulders tight, steps uneven. The wind pushed through the broken gap in the fence, lifting dry leaves into small, frantic spirals. I closed the door again, calmer than I should have been. The Parkers were unraveling. Whatever they were hiding was becoming heavier than they could carry, and storms, once they start cracking roofs, don't stop on their own. That night, I didn't bother pretending I could sleep. The wind had died down, but the silence left behind felt unnatural, like someone had pressed a palm over the whole neighborhood's mouth. I sat in my armchair, with the lamp turned low, and listened. Not for danger exactly, just for truth. Truth always makes a sound if you learn to hear it. Near midnight, a faint engine hum drifted through the air, not a car on the street. Closer, slower. I stood and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see without being seen. A black pickup rolled into the Parkers' driveway, lights off. 2 men stepped out, not boys, not neighbors. Strangers with the kind of posture that said they were used to being obeyed. One wore a jacket too heavy for the warm night. The other carried a clipboard. Men don't bring clipboards at midnight unless they intend to make something official in a very unofficial way. The garage door rose halfway, then shuddered to a stop as Mark pulled it open manually. He looked jumpy, pale, almost sick. The strangers stepped inside without greeting him. I leaned closer to the glass, my heart steady, but my breath refusing to deepen. The men started examining crates, rows of them stacked tight, some marked with brand logos I recognized from electronics catalogs. Expensive equipment, too expensive for a family who claimed they could barely afford a new fence board. I watched as one of the men opened a crate. Even from my window, I saw the glint of something metallic, sealed plastic, neatly packaged, no dust. Not stolen from some yard sale. Stolen from somewhere organized. Mark said something I couldn't hear. One of the men snapped back at him, sharp enough to make Mark flinch. Another crate was opened, then another. Then one of the strangers slammed the lid shut and threw his flashlight across the floor, cursing. Whatever they found wasn't what they expected. The air around my house tightened, as if the night itself was bracing for impact. I wanted to look away. At my age, peace matters more than curiosity. But peace isn't real when danger sits 20 yards from your kitchen door. So I kept watching. Helen appeared next, tugged from the house by one of the men. She had a hand pressed to her mouth like she was holding in something. Fear or anger, I couldn't tell. She said something to him, pleading. He didn't look at her, just waved her off like a buzzing fly. Dylan stood near the edge of the driveway, arms wrapped around himself. He looked younger than usual. Children always look younger when they're afraid. One of the strangers jabbed a finger toward my house, toward my dark window. A simple gesture, but enough. I stepped back, heart steady but colder now. They knew I existed. They noticed I watched, and that meant, sooner or later, they'd decide what to do about it. I turned off the lamp until the room fell into soft, comforting darkness. From there, I listened to the muffled shouting, to boxes being dragged, to van doors slamming. I heard Helen cry out once, a short, choked sound, but then nothing more. Around 1 a.m, the pickup left without headlights. The garage door closed. Silence returned, but not the natural kind. This one felt heavier, like a lid placed on a boiling pot. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light slipped across my floor, I finally rose and made tea. My hands shook a little, but not from fear, from decision. By mid-morning, I walked outside to pick up the fallen branches from the night's wind. I didn't need to. The yard could have waited. But I wanted the Parkers to see me out there, upright, unhidden, not a woman they could erase with warnings. I felt eyes on me from their kitchen window. Helen's silhouette appeared for a moment, then vanished. She didn't come out, but someone else did. The stranger from last night, the taller one, walked out of the garage like he belonged to the property more than the Parkers themselves. He looked straight at me, expression flat as river stone. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lifted his chin, as if marking me in some invisible ledger. Not a threat, not yet, but a notation. Seen, registered, considered. He turned and walked back inside. That was the moment the truth settled fully onto my shoulders. What they were doing wasn't petty crime or backyard greed. This was organized, structured, monitored, and the Parkers were failing at it. Failure in that world doesn't end with apologies. I gathered the branches, placed them neatly by the bin, and went back inside. I shut the door gently, locked it, and stood still. Not frightened, not panicked, just certain. Something was coming, and whether I wanted it or not, I was now part of the story. The morning after the strangers came, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Not strength exactly. Strength is for youth. This was something quieter, denser, like a stone warmed by time. A decision had begun forming inside me during the long hours of darkness, and by sunrise, it had settled into place. I brewed tea and sat at the kitchen table, letting the steam rise against my face. My hands still trembled, but not from fear. It was the tremor of a woman who finally realizes she's reached the age where silence is no longer noble, just wasteful. I opened the drawer where I kept my phone. Not because I planned to call anyone. At my age, phone calls often mean bad news or bills. But this morning, I needed something different. A safeguard. I searched through the settings until I found what I'd once dismissed as unnecessary, the emergency shortcut. A simple button press that could send a silent alert straight to the police dispatch. No explanations needed. No long conversations where a tired operator tried to decide whether an old woman was confused or genuinely in danger. One button, a small private rebellion. I set it up slowly, making sure I understood each step. My fingers were stiff, but steadier than my nerves. When it was done, I placed the phone on the table and rested my palm on it. The weight of it felt comforting, a lifeline disguised as an ordinary object. Outside, voices rose from the Parker yard, not shouting, yet, but tight enough to sound like rope pulled too hard. I heard Mark bark something. Helen snapped back. Then silence. Heavy, resigned. People often believe chaos is loud. It isn't. True chaos is abrupt quiet, the kind that follows when everyone realizes the situation has slipped from their grasp. Around noon, I went out to my porch with a small screwdriver. The loose board in the fence had been tapping all night like a nervous pulse. I wasn't strong enough to repair it fully, but I could at least secure it better. I had barely started when Dylan appeared on the other side of the fence. His eyes were swollen, whether from sleep or tears I couldn't tell. Boys his age hide their pain until it burns through. "You shouldn't be out here," he muttered. "It's my yard," I said. He pulled his hoodie tighter. Mom says you shouldn't make things harder. Harder for whom? He didn't answer. He kept glancing toward the garage as if someone inside was listening. Fear suited him poorly. Children should fear exams, not adults. You're not safe, he whispered. A strange warmth moved through me, not comfort, but recognition. He wasn't warning me out of malice. He was warning me because he finally understood what the adults around him refused to admit. I'll be all right, I said softly. He shook his head. No, you won't. None of us will. Before I could ask more, he darted back through the gate and disappeared. I stood there for a long moment, screwdriver still in hand, wind brushing my hair like an absent-minded friend. The boy's words clung to me the rest of the afternoon. Not safe. Not safe for an old woman. Not safe for a family drowning in its own secrets. By evening, the garage door opened again. Another van. Another set of boxes. This time the men worked quickly, no wasted movements. Urgency had hardened into desperation. I turned off my lights early. Sat in my armchair with the curtains drawn, waiting. Not for confrontation, but for the moment when I could no longer pretend this would resolve itself peacefully. My phone was on the table beside me, screen dark, silent. Just one button. I hoped I'd never have to press it. But hope is a fragile thing. And the Parkers' world was cracking faster than they could patch it. By Saturday, the neighborhood seemed to hold itself differently, as if even the houses felt the tension thickening the air. People walking dogs lingered less. Curtains that were usually open stayed shut. Fear moves quietly, but you can always tell when it settles in a place. It changes how the wind sounds. I stepped outside around mid-morning to trim the brittle branches on my camellias. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but I preferred work that kept me grounded. Soil doesn't lie the way people do. I had barely begun when 3 young men walked past on the sidewalk, friends of Mark, though friends wasn't the right word. Boys like that orbit trouble like moths around porch lights. One nudged the others when he saw me. "That her?" he asked loudly, as if I were deaf in addition to old. Mark wasn't with them, but his shadow seemed to trail behind them all the same. The tallest one cupped his hands around his mouth. "Morning, Grandma. Still spying on your neighbors?" The others laughed, not because it was funny, but because cruelty is easier than thinking. I kept trimming. The branch snapped cleanly between my fingers. "You hear us?" he shouted again. "We're talking to you." "I hear you," I said without looking up. "I'm simply choosing not to waste breath responding." That earned a chorus of groans, the kind boys make when cafeteria bravado falters. They started to walk on, but the tall one hesitated. He stepped closer to my gate, leaning in just enough to signal ownership of a space that did not belong to him. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "old ladies who stick their noses where they shouldn't. Sometimes they get hurt." He meant it to intimidate. It only clarified things. I stood upright, pruners in hand, and met his eyes through the slats of the fence. "Boys who issue threats," I said, "often don't understand the weight of their own words until someone else carries them." He smirked, but there was a crack in it. Real fear recognizes steadiness, even when it doesn't respect it. They moved on at last. The tallest one threw a rock into my yard as a parting gesture. It landed near the birch tree, small, childish, telling. I picked it up and placed it neatly on the porch railing. Evidence sometimes comes from the most immature hands. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. I stayed indoors, though not from fear. I simply needed space to think. Every hour, the same truth settled deeper into me. The Parkers were losing control, and people who lose control tend to claw at everyone around them. Around 4 in the afternoon, someone knocked on my door. Not hard, not rude, just quick, nervous taps. I opened it to find Evelyn again, her terrier trembling like a frightened leaf. "Agnes," she said breathlessly. "I think something happened." I guided her inside. "What is it?" They were arguing again, loudly. I heard something crash, and then she hesitated. "I heard Mark say your name." My body responded before my mind did, a slow tightening in my chest. "What exactly did he say?" I asked. "He said, 'She's watching. She's the problem.'" And Helen told him to keep his voice down before someone else heard. Someone else, meaning anyone who wasn't already entangled in their chaos. I thanked Evelyn, made her tea, reassured her until she stopped trembling. She left reluctantly, glancing over her shoulder like a woman expecting thunder. After she was gone, I closed my door and locked it. Then I checked my phone. Not obsessively, just enough to see the dark screen resting where I'd left it earlier. The world inside my home felt smaller, but sharper too. When you age, your world shrinks in physical space but expands in clarity. Threads reveal themselves. Patterns emerge, and every pattern now pointed in one direction. The Parkers were unraveling. Unraveling people lash out, and lashing out people seek a target. I sat in my armchair, folding my hands in my lap. The house creaked softly around me, old wood settling like an exhale. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose fence board in its tired rhythm. Let them talk. Let them sneer. Let them warn me in clumsy, borrowed threats. I had lived too long to be frightened by noise. What frightened me was the quiet that would follow, because that was when people like the Parkers finally acted. Sunday arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that makes even birds reconsider singing. I woke before dawn, not from rest, but from the sensation that the house itself had been holding its breath all night. My joints ached, as if warning me to move carefully, though the danger was no longer in my bones. It was outside, pacing restlessly behind the Parkers' walls. I made oatmeal, stirred it twice, then pushed the bowl aside. Hunger doesn't visit often when tension sits at the table first. Around 8, I stepped onto the porch to water my plants. A simple routine, but routines are anchors. When life tilts, you hold on to what you still control. I had just reached the camellias when a shout cut through the morning. It came from the Parkers' yard. Then another shout, then a crash, glass or metal, I couldn't tell. I froze, watering can suspended in my hand. A moment later, their side gate burst open. Mark stormed through it, face red and twisted, breath ragged. Behind him, Helen yelled something desperate, but he didn't look back. He marched straight across their yard and, without hesitation, onto mine. He didn't knock. He didn't call my name. He simply kicked my already damaged fence board until it snapped clean off and dropped at his feet. Then he stepped through the gap as if he had been invited. I set the watering can down. "You're trespassing," I said. "Shut up," he snapped. His voice cracked on the last word. Not with uncertainty, but with something worse. An instability that comes when a man is too overwhelmed to choose between anger and fear. "You've been spying on us," he said, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Mom says you've been watching. Dylan says you've been watching. You think we don't notice?" "I notice when people break my fence." when they drag crates across my lawn, when strangers visit at midnight. He flinched. A quick, involuntary movement. Truth often hits harder than accusation. "Stay out of it," he barked. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know enough." "No," he shouted, stepping closer. "You don't, and you're making it worse. For us. For yourself." My heart suggested I back up, but my spine insisted I remain still. 78 years of life had taught me that movement can be read as fear, and fear only whets the appetite of men like Mark. "I am not your problem," I said. "The hell you aren't." His boot struck my porch step, sending a sharp crack through the wood. "If you'd just kept quiet, none of this would have happened." There it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. Whatever they were involved in, whatever mess had grown too tangled to hide, they needed me silent to survive. But silence at my age is a choice, not a duty. Behind Mark, Helen appeared at the broken fence line. Her hair was wild, her face blotched from crying or screaming. I couldn't tell which. "Mark," she yelled, "get back here." He ignored her. "You're going to listen to me," he snarled at me, leaning in. "You're going to stop watching. You're going to stop talking. And you're going to pretend you haven't seen anything. Do you understand?" I looked at him. Really looked. At the desperation trembling under his anger. At the bruises blooming under his collar. At the shadows under his eyes from nights spent dragging crates that weren't his to drag. "I understand you're scared," I said quietly. His face twisted. "Don't you dare. You're scared because you know this is bigger than you." For a heartbeat, the world went still. Then he shoved the porch railing hard enough that the wood splintered beneath his palm. "Mind your own business," he screamed. "Or so help me." "Mark," Helen's voice cracked. "Stop. Please." He turned, fury choking him from inside. She reached for his arm. He yanked away. She stumbled. For a brief moment, her eyes met mine, wide, pleading, exhausted. She wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to stop him from crossing a line he couldn't uncross. He stepped toward me again, but this time, his anger had no direction, just force. Wild, stupid force. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. "Leave," I said. It was the calmest word I'd spoken in days, and somehow the most powerful. He blinked, disoriented by the quiet authority of it. Then he spat a curse, turned abruptly, and stormed back through the broken fence. Helen followed him, calling his name with a tremor that suggested she no longer recognized the boy she'd raised. When they were gone, the silence returned. Thick, uneasy, expectant. I picked up the watering can and finished tending the camellias, though my hands shook now in a way they hadn't before. Mark hadn't threatened me. He had warned me, and warnings, unlike threats, come from people who know exactly how bad things can get. By Monday morning, the neighborhood felt hollow, as if something heavy had passed through in the night and taken all the air with it. Even the birds stayed quiet. I moved through the house slowly, straightening blankets, wiping counters, pretending I had control over more than the few square feet beneath my feet. But control is a fragile illusion, especially when fear begins to choose for other people. Around 11, I heard footsteps on gravel. Several sets, hurried, uncoordinated. Then a hard knock on my front door. Not the angry kind, the purposeful kind. The kind meant to show you that whoever stands behind it has already decided the tone of the conversation. I opened it a few inches, and there they were. Helen, Mark, Dylan, All three standing on my porch like a broken family portrait. Helen's eyes were raw, rimmed red. Mark looked furious and exhausted all at once. And Dylan? Dylan looked like someone who had stopped hoping to be heard. "Open the door," Helen said. Her voice cracked. "We need to talk." I held the door steady. Talking hasn't gone well for us so far. "It wasn't a request," Mark growled. "I didn't think it was," I answered. He took a step forward, but Helen reached across him, pressing both hands against the doorframe as if holding herself up. "Please," she whispered. Just listen. We don't want any more trouble." Her desperation softened me, but only slightly. Pity is not permission. "What do you want?" I asked. "To make things right," she said too quickly, "to calm everything down." "To stop you from calling anyone," Mark added, ever honest in the worst ways. I looked at him. "Why would I call anyone?" His jaw tightened. "You know why." I let silence answer him. Dylan shifted, hands deep in his pockets. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the ground, at the porch, at anything that wasn't his brother's face. Helen took a shaky breath. "Agnes, we're asking you, woman to woman. Please stop watching us. Stop asking questions. Stop." Her voice broke. "Stop being involved." I met her gaze, tired, scared, hollowed out by consequences she didn't know how to outrun. "I am involved," I said quietly. "You made me involved." "No," Mark snapped. "You did that yourself." "How?" I asked. "By existing next door? By having eyes? By keeping my gate closed?" His nostrils flared. "By not staying in your place." There it was, the truth stripped bare. Helen whispered, "Mark, stop." But he cut her off, stepping close enough that I could smell the sweat of panic on him. "Just sit quietly and let us handle things, for your own good. Sit quietly, old woman." The words didn't sting. They didn't shock me. They simply clarified everything that had gone wrong in his mind and in theirs. I opened the door wider, not in invitation, but in certainty, and looked directly into his eyes. "No," I said. "I will not sit quietly." He blinked, thrown off balance by how gently I'd said it. I continued, voice low, even. "Your fear is not my duty. Your mess is not my burden, and your crimes are not my silence." His skin flushed a deep, angry red. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand survival," I said. "I've been doing it longer than you've been alive." Helen began to cry, quiet, embarrassed tears she wiped away with the back of her hand. "Agnes, please, just don't call anyone. Not today. Not now." Dylan finally looked up at me then, his eyes filled with something almost like apology. "We didn't mean for it to get this bad," he whispered. "We didn't." I softened my posture, but not my conviction. "I know, Dylan, but the truth doesn't bend just because someone is tired of carrying it." Mark stepped forward again, too close, too tense. For a moment I thought he might grab the door or my arm or anything to regain control. Instead, he whispered, "If you make one wrong move, they'll come for you too. The men we're dealing with, they don't leave loose ends." "That's exactly why I won't sit quietly," I replied. "Loose ends disappear. Witnesses vanish. But noisy old women tend to survive, Mark. We make too much trouble." He didn't understand the joke. But Helen did. Her face crumpled, half in fear, half in something like disbelief. I closed the door gently but firmly. No slamming, no dramatics, just a clear boundary drawn at last. Through the wood I heard Helen choke back a sob, heard Mark mutter a curse, heard Dylan whisper, "We're out of time." And they were. So was I. But time, once it runs out, stops favoring the bold and begins favoring the prepared. My phone sat on the kitchen table. One button. Not yet. But soon. Very soon. The rest of Monday moved with the slow, dragging weight of a day that knows it will end badly. I kept to my rooms, not hiding exactly, but conserving what little strength a woman my age has for conflict. Quiet is a useful companion when danger circles outside your walls. By dusk, the air had turned sharp and metallic, like the moments before lightning. I sat by the window, watching the Parkers' house flicker with tense silhouettes. Shadows paced. Voices rose, then dropped into fearful murmurs. Something inside that house was coming undone faster than they could stitch it back. I knew the moment would come. Trouble always gives warning if you listen. And around 8 in the evening, the warning arrived. A violent slam shook the side of my house, then another, then angry footsteps pounding across my porch. Before I could stand, the front door shuddered under a heavy fist. "Agnes!" Mark's voice, ragged, frantic. "Open this damn door!" I didn't move. The second blow rattled the hinges. "You think you can ruin us? You think you can just call people? You think we don't know what you're planning?" I hadn't called anyone yet. But the fact that he believed I might told me everything I needed to know. Behind his shouting came Helen's voice, thin and panicked. "Mark, stop! Stop it, please!" He ignored her. Another slam. The wood groaned. "You come out here right now!" he yelled. "Or I swear!" I reached for the phone on the table. My hand hovered above it only a breath, maybe less. The decision wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't feel like bravery. It felt like necessity. I picked it up. My thumb found the button I had set 2 days ago. One press. A long, steady vibration. No sound. The kind of help that comes without questioning whether your age has muddled the story. Outside, the pounding continued. "Open it. Open the door." His voice contained something beyond anger now, fear tipping into desperation. Men like Mark don't fear consequences. They fear the moment their control slips, and mine had slipped from him entirely. I stepped back from the door. Not far. Just far enough that if the wood gave way, he wouldn't immediately reach me. Helen screamed his name again. I heard Dylan pleading with him, voice cracking. The chaos outside grew louder, then suddenly stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of someone's ragged breathing on the other side of the door. Then hurried footsteps. Then silence. True silence. The kind that arrives only when people run. I stood still, phone in hand, letting my heart slow. It took less than 2 minutes for the distant sirens to appear. I heard them first as a faint hum, then a rising wail echoing against the quiet houses. The Parkers' porch light flicked off. A car door slammed. Someone shouted in panic, too far to make out words. I didn't open my door. I didn't step outside. I simply waited. Waiting is its own kind of strength, one older women learn better than anyone. The sirens grew louder, sharp, unhurried, confident. They weren't searching. They were coming to someone who had already asked. My house felt steady around me as the first police car turned onto the street. My thumb was still resting on the silent alert button, though it no longer mattered. Help was here. And for the first time in days, I felt the smallest easing in my chest. Not relief. Relief is too soft, too early. What I felt was recognition. The moment had come, and I had met it standing. The police arrived the way storms do in the Midwest. Swiftly, without negotiation. Two cruisers rolled to a stop in front of the Parker house, lights spinning silently before the sirens finally cut off. The sudden stillness afterward made the night feel even sharper, as if the air itself were waiting to see what would break first. I stayed inside, not out of fear, but because presence is not always participation. Sometimes the strongest thing an old woman can do is remain exactly where she is and let the truth move toward her. Through the thin curtain, I saw the first officer step out, a tall, broad man with the posture of someone who'd learned long ago not to underestimate a quiet street. A younger woman followed him, her flashlight already sweeping across the driveway. They approached the Parkers' porch. Helen opened the door before they knocked. Even from my window, I could see how she shook. Hands trembling, shoulders tight, voice caught in her throat. She tried to speak, but the officer held up a steady hand. "Ma'am, we received a distress alert from your neighbor," he said, nodding toward my house. Her head snapped toward me so quickly it was almost painful to watch. Shock, fear, betrayal. They passed across her face in layers. But she didn't deny anything. She didn't even try. The taller officer walked to the edge of my lawn and called out gently, "Ms. Mercer? You all right in there?" I unlocked the door and opened it halfway. "I'm fine," I said. Someone was attempting to force entry. "Is he here now?" the officer asked. "No," I answered, but he was. Behind him, the female officer's flashlight hit the broken section of my fence. She crouched, examined the splintered wood, then followed the trail of crushed grass leading straight to my porch. "This damage is fresh," she called out. Mark appeared then, pulled outside by another officer I hadn't noticed. His face was flushed, fists clenched, indignation bubbling beneath a thin layer of false composure. He jerked his arm away when they guided him toward the driveway. "I didn't touch her," he snapped. "I didn't do anything." "You kicked my door," I said quietly. "And my fence." He glared at me with something between hatred and shame. "You don't know what you've done," he muttered. But I did. I knew exactly. The officer separated him from Helen and Dylan. The younger boy looked pale, guilty, hollowed out. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Ma'am," the female officer said to me, "did you feel threatened?" "I felt," I answered carefully, "that harm was likely." She nodded. She understood. Older women don't use dramatic words. We state truth as plainly as we breathe. They asked me to describe what happened. I gave them the facts. No embellishments. No trembling voice. Just details. The pounding on the door, the yelling, the threat implied, the history of damage and intrusion. I mentioned the midnight visitors, the crates, the shouting. The moment I said crates, both officers exchanged a quick look. Not alarmed, aware. "Thank you, Ms. Mercer," the tall one said. "We've had concerns about activity in this area. Your information helps clarify things." Clarify. A gentle word for expose. Across the lawn, Helen covered her face with both hands. A small, broken sound escaped her. Too soft for the officers, but not soft enough to escape me. Dylan placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't lean into it. Mark stood rigid, fury fading into a dawning realization that this time he couldn't shout his way out. The female officer approached me again. "We'll be here a while, ma'am. Stay inside for now." I nodded and stepped back from the doorway. Before closing it, I said one last thing, not for them, but for myself. "Thank you for coming." The door clicked shut. My house wrapped itself around me again, quiet, steady, familiar. But something fundamental had shifted in the world outside. The Parkers' chaos was no longer contained behind their walls. It was visible now, noticed, documented. And once the truth is seen, it's hard to bury again. The police stayed on our street far longer than I expected. Blue lights pulsed against the houses, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat the neighborhood hadn't felt in years. People peeked through blinds, then disappeared again. No one wanted to be seen watching, except me. I'd earned the right to look directly at things. From my window, I saw officers moving in and out of the Parker garage. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They simply worked with the steadiness of people who already suspected what they would find. At one point, 3 officers carried out a crate together, heavy enough that their boots sank into the grass. Another officer photographed everything: the boxes, the torn cardboard, the scratched concrete floor. Whatever the Parkers had been hiding was no longer theirs to hide. Closer to the porch, Helen sat on the steps, elbows on her knees, face in her hands. Her body rocked gently, the way a person moves when trying to quiet a sound only they can hear. Dylan hovered beside her, unsure whether to comfort or retreat. He settled for standing still. Mark was separate from them, kept near a cruiser with an officer by his side. He wasn't handcuffed, but his hands remained clenched, as if gripping invisible restraints. He kept glancing toward my house, then away, like a man arguing silently with his own pride. Eventually, one of the officers approached my door again. I opened it before he knocked. "Ms. Mercer," he said, softening his tone, "we found items in the garage that match reports from a larger investigation. Stolen electronics, distribution logs, some documents that suggest the operation extends beyond this neighborhood." I nodded. I wasn't surprised. People rarely destroy themselves for small things. It's the larger sins that demand secrecy. "We'll need a statement later," he continued. "Not tonight. Just rest and keep your door locked." "I planned to," I said. His gaze drifted past me into the quiet of my home, as if checking for signs of distress. He found none. Age teaches a woman how to live with both grief and danger without rearranging the furniture. "Your alert came at the right time," he added. "Could have ended differently." "I know," I replied. He gave me a respectful nod and left. Hours passed. The sky deepened from blue to black, but the lights outside stayed bright. The officers eventually began collecting evidence, loading crates into vans, not hurried, not careless. Methodical. Certain. It wasn't until near midnight that they escorted the Parkers inside their home for further questioning. I watched Helen stand, swaying slightly. She looked smaller somehow, as if her body had folded inward to shield whatever pieces were left of her life. Dylan guided her with a trembling hand on her back. Mark followed last. His steps were angry, defiant, but no longer confident. His world had cracked open, and the light inside it wasn't flattering. When the police finally drove away, the street exhaled. Houses relaxed. Curtains shifted. Even the wind moved more freely, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from its shoulders. I locked my door for the final time that night. The house seemed to settle with me, wood creaking softly, like an old friend adjusting in its chair. I wasn't triumphant. Triumph is for battles fought loudly. This had been something else. A slow erosion of fear, a quiet reclaiming of ground I had lived on for decades. My phone lay on the table, still turned to the alert screen. I pressed the button to clear it. The screen went dark again, simple and calm. Outside, the Parkers' yard, once loud, messy, frantic, sat in silence. Not peace, just truth. And truth once uncovered, begins to change everything it touches. The morning after the police left, the street looked almost ordinary. Sunlight fell across the pavement in long, clean strokes, and for a brief moment, I could pretend the chaos of the last days had been nothing more than a restless dream. But truth doesn't dissolve in daylight. It lingers, even in the quiet corners. I rose slowly, feeling every year in my knees, and made tea. The house felt different, lighter, as if the walls had unclenched. I carried my cup to the porch and stepped outside. The air was crisp, bright, honest. I breathed it in. For the first time in weeks, no one shouted across the fence. No crates thudded in the garage. No strangers stood smoking on the driveway. Only the wind moved, brushing through the broken slats like fingers on a harp. I walked along the edge of my yard, inspecting the damage. The torn fence board, the splintered railing where Mark had struck it, the crushed patch of grass where he'd stood shouting. These marks weren't pretty, but they were proof. Evidence that I had endured something and stayed standing. Survival leaves traces, just like harm does. Across the way, the Parker house looked unnaturally still, curtains drawn, no cars moving. No voices. For a moment, I wondered whether they were inside arguing or exhausted, or simply grieving the collapse of a lie they had lived inside too long. Helen appeared briefly at the kitchen window. She wasn't looking for me. She was looking through me, eyes unfocused, face pale with the shock of someone learning her life had foundations she never truly saw. When her gaze accidentally met mine, she didn't scowl or turn away. She just paused. Her expression softened into something fragile, an acknowledgement without apology. I nodded once. She didn't nod back, but she didn't hide either. That was enough. A few minutes later, Evelyn crossed the street slowly, her terrier pulling nervously at the leash. She stopped at the foot of my walkway. "Agnes," she said, her voice trembling, "I heard the commotion last night. Are you all right?" "I am," I answered. "Tired, but all right." She let out a breath she'd held longer than she realized. "I'm glad. We've all been worried. All of us. All of us. For years, I'd thought the street had stopped seeing me, but perhaps they'd only grown quiet, the way people do when they don't know how to help." Evelyn hesitated. "If you need anything, groceries, repairs, company, just tell me. Nathan from down the block said he'd fix your railing if you'd allow it. People want to help now. People want to help now." The words were gentle, but something inside me tightened at them, not in bitterness, simply in recognition of how long I had handled things alone. Yet I didn't push her away. "Thank you," I said. "Tell Nathan I'll leave the railing open for him." She smiled, relief softening her whole posture, and walked on. The terrier barked once at the Parker house, then tucked itself close to Evelyn's leg. When she was gone, I returned to the porch and sat with my tea. Steam curled into the cool air like a quiet blessing. My hands wrapped around the cup, steady now. The world had not become safer overnight. The investigation was only beginning. The Parkers were not villains, just people who had fallen into something larger than they could handle. And I was not a hero, just an old woman who refused to vanish when told to. But something had shifted in me, in the house, in the street. The fear was no longer mine to carry. I looked toward the broken fence again. I would mend it, or someone else would. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it would stand again. I would stand again. And for the first time in a long while, the day felt possible. The days that followed unfolded slowly, as if the whole street were learning how to breathe again. People moved differently, quieter, gentler, as though embarrassed by how long they had ignored the tension creeping across our lawns. A neighborhood remembers more than it admits. And now, finally, it seemed ready to remember aloud. Late Wednesday morning, I heard the crunch of gravel outside my porch. Not the heavy thud of angry boots, but a careful tread, a hesitant one. When I stepped outside, I saw Nathan from 2 doors down, carrying a toolkit and a plank of sturdy cedar wood. "Ms. Mercer," he said, tipping his head. "Figured today was as good a day as any to fix that railing." "You don't have to," I replied. "I know," he said with a small, genuine smile. "That's why I want to." There are moments when kindness feels sharper than cruelty. This was one of them. I nodded and stepped aside. He worked quietly, respectfully, measuring twice, cutting once, sanding everything until it felt smooth enough for a child's hand. When he finished, he wiped the dust from his palms and looked at the railing with a soft pride. "That should hold," he said. For a good long while. "It's more than I expected," I told him. "It's what you deserved from the start," he said, almost under his breath. Then he wished me a good day and left without lingering for thanks. Later that afternoon, Evelyn brought over a container of chicken soup. She set it on the porch table with a tenderness that reminded me of years when neighbors still looked after each other out of instinct, not obligation. "It's nothing fancy," she said, "but you shouldn't have to cook while everything settles." I touched her arm gently. "Thank you, Evelyn." As she walked away, I realized how long it had been since someone had shown me uncomplicated care. Not politeness, not pity. Care. Just before dusk, I heard another soft tap at my gate. So soft I almost missed it. When I looked up, I saw Dylan standing there, shifting from foot to foot. No swagger this time. No hoodie pulled over his eyes. Just a boy who had grown far too quickly into consequences he couldn't outrun. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I brought this." In his hands, he held a small wooden birdhouse, painted in quiet shades of blue and white. The paint wasn't clean. Brushstrokes were uneven, but the effort was unmistakable. "I made it," he said, eyes fixed on the ground. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I wanted to give you something that wasn't trouble." The sincerity in his voice was enough to soften even the ache in my chest. "May I see it?" I asked. He stepped closer, placing the birdhouse carefully into my hands. It was simple, honest. A child's attempt at apology, but also something more. A sign he understood the weight of his family's actions better than any adult in that house had. "It's lovely," I said. "Thank you, Dylan." His shoulders rose with a small, shaky breath. "I'm sorry," he whispered. For everything. Children apologize for the sins of the people who should protect them. It isn't fair, but fairness is rarely invited to situations like these. "I know," I said. "Go home, dear." He nodded, quick and timid, then slipped back through the gate, disappearing into the dimming light. I stayed outside a while longer, holding the birdhouse, feeling its rough paint under my thumb. The street was quiet again, but not the frightened quiet from before. This one felt gentler, a pause rather than a warning. People didn't look away from me anymore when they passed. They nodded. Some even smiled, small but sincere. Not because I had defeated anything, but because I had endured it. The world doesn't reward endurance with parades. It rewards it with recognition. And sometimes that is enough. I set the birdhouse on the porch railing Nathan had repaired. It looked right there, solid wood supporting something fragile, both pieces waiting for new life to fill them. The evening sunlight slipped across my yard, warm and golden, touching the broken fence, the repaired railing, the quiet house beside mine. Maybe peace was still far, but dignity, my dignity, was already home. In the days that followed, the neighborhood settled into a rhythm I barely recognized, gentler, slower, as if everyone had agreed without speaking that noise should be reserved for safer times. My porch railing stood firm. The birdhouse Dylan made caught the morning light just right, and the repaired fence no longer tapped in the wind like a nervous heartbeat. I spent my mornings with tea, my afternoons tending to the plants, and my evenings watching the sun walk itself down the street. Nothing dramatic happened. No more shouting. No more threats. The Parkers kept to themselves while the investigation continued. Their cars came and went with none of the old urgency, none of the late-night secrets. I sometimes saw Helen through the blinds, tired, careful, quieter. Dylan waved once from a distance. Mark never looked in my direction again. And that was fine. Peace doesn't arrive with trumpets. It slips in on soft feet, settles into corners, and asks nothing in return. I welcomed it like an old companion finally finding its way home. One evening, as the sky turned a soft, bruised lavender, I stepped outside and sat on the porch. The wood beneath me was warm, solid, trustworthy. A year ago, I might have wondered whether anyone would sit beside me. Now I knew I didn't need anyone to fill the silence for it to feel full. I thought about how many years I'd spent teaching myself to stay small, to not trouble anyone, to make myself easy to ignore. Age trains you in many things: patience, endurance, the art of letting go. But it also teaches you the cost of shrinking for other people's comfort. I'd carried that cost long enough. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of early blooming jasmine. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Somewhere closer, a screen door clicked shut. Life, persistent and ordinary, continued. I placed my hand on the repaired railing, feeling the grain under my fingertips. I was still here, upright, unbroken, and not quiet. Not in the way they had demanded from me. There is a dignity in speaking up, even softly. There is a power in refusing to disappear. And there is a kind of victory that requires no celebration at all, only a steady breath and an open door. If anyone reading this finds their own voice ignored or dimmed, hear me now. Don't fold yourself into silence for convenience's sake. Don't give away your place in the world just because someone else prefers you small. Raise your voice, gently if you must, firmly when you can. And if my story stayed with you, tell me so. Leave a comment, share a thought, pass it on. Let it mean something beyond these pages. I sat on my porch until the last light faded, listening to a world that finally sounded like it belonged to me again.